Ladies and gentlemen, is this on? Ladies and gentlemen, is this on, Teresa? Ladies and gentlemen, got it?
It's not good. Somebody was down here checking it earlier.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. I do know that many of you are still eating, but in the interest of time, I'd like to go ahead and start our program with General Minihan. Our luncheon keynote speaker today is General Kenneth A. Minihan, and he is currently a managing director in the Paladin Capital Group in Washington, D.C. Of course, of more relevance to our conference today is the fact that from 1996 until his retirement from the United States Air Force in May of 1999, culminating a distinguished military career of 33 years, General Minihan was the 14th director of the National Security Agency Central Security Office, a combat support agency of the Department of Defense with military and civilian personnel stationed worldwide, and of course an agency that has been much in the news lately with regard to this whole issue of domestic surveillance. As the director of the National Security Agency, General Minihan was the senior uniformed intelligence officer in the Department of Defense. He originally entered the Air Force in 1966 as a distinguished graduate of Florida State University and its ROTC program. Thereafter, he served in a number of prestigious assignments, including as the Senior Intelligence Officer for Tactical Air Command during the First Persian Gulf War of 1990 and 91, and later for the Air Force from 1994 until 1995. He served as Commander of Air Force Intelligence Command and then the Air Intelligence Command and Joint Electronic Warfare Center from 1993 until 1994. And also as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, from 1995 until 1996, when he became the director of the National Security Agency. On a personal note, I had the privilege and pleasure of serving with General Minihan at Tactical Air Command during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and interacted with him in that capacity. And I've always had the highest respect and regard for him as an expert in the field of intelligence, as an officer, and as a gentleman. So without further ado, I present to you General Ken Minihan. General Minihan.
Scott, thanks. I can tell you don't have a polygraph program here at Duke University, or he wouldn't be telling all those lies in front of us. It's an honor for me to be here and join you for lunch. When Scott called, I always come, this is my second or third trip down here, I think, to do something like this with Scott. I think they're great forums, and so it's a wonderful opportunity, in my view, to discuss some of the really tough issues. And I like this characterization of this domestic spying, because that's not what I'm going to talk about. You'll find that my characterization is going to be surveilling the enemy during combat. And I want to share with you what I think are the substantial complexities of that surveillance challenge today. And I want to do it in a way that there's some understanding of what I think is a pattern of very complex issues which can only be resolved in forums like this. And I was talking with Scott as we walked back here about what I would hope would ultimately turn out to be a panel of some type or some study which would deal with the issues that I'll try and trot out here as a part of this lunch. Because they won't get resolved inside the Beltway. they're substantial over a long period of time, and I believe they're worthy of the great thinkers that you have down in this area. As Scott said, to be fair, I'm a Florida State guy. You had to have a 4.0 to graduate. I had a 2.01, so I got a B in ROTC once. I had been drafted in 1962. We all knew we were going to Vietnam. I made it there by 1969. Have no interest in going back. While I was there, they tried to kill me as far as I could tell. And so, but I got into the intelligence business as a part of that career, and I loved it, absolutely loved it. I like to tell people I never met better folks, Scott, and all of the folks like that which I met. Never worked with a brighter, more energetic, more hardworking group of people over a long period of time. And you might say I had a hard day on occasion, but I never had a bad day. So I always got up and wanted to go to work. And that resulted in, for me, a great career and a great opportunity to serve the country. So I think the accomplishments of the past are substantial in allowing us to come together in this period that we do here. And I think it's important that you kind of think your way through how do we contribute to that same sort of pattern of stability as we go forward in the conflictual world that we're in. So my comments are going to kind of come in that context. I recognize that this is not a technical discussion for some of you in this room, and it's not a technical discussion for me either. As the director of the National Security Agency, you get involved, and I don't ever remember somebody calling me up and saying, I've got a good idea, what do you think? Typically the calls goes, we have a really tough problem and we need some help, and we're going to start looking at it Saturday afternoon at 2. And so you always, like lawyers in a way, you got the call when something wasn't going well. And that's the nature of that business, and I loved every moment of it. But I also, our family had 2 boys in the war, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. One of our sons was in the Pentagon. I saw the airplane fly into the Pentagon on the side he worked at the time. So it isn't technical from a family perspective either, and I'm sure some of you either have friends or are in this room who have that same interest. So my focus is going to be to try and think about balancing this interplay between the law and the rule of good order in the United States of America and intelligence, a wonder of the world in the 20th century which led to great periods of peace and is a very important characteristic as we go forward in our great country. And I'm going to characterize it in sort of 3 areas as we look at it. One, there is a change in the situation in the United States in that we are at war. And acting like you're at war in this technology environment that we're in is a very complex challenge right now, substantially different than the challenges of the 20th century. 2, I'm going to use this term detect, and I'm going to position it in a homeland security sense in front of protect, defend, cope, and recover. Detect is the very front end, and it's the cherished, difficult place that we put the intelligence community, and it's the difficult place that we ask agencies like the National Security Agency and other agencies to go and operate so that we can know the most. We want a peak before bad things happen to us. And then foreign intelligence. How do you think about turning that process of detection into something that's useful to someone who might need it at the proper time and get that to them so that it can have an effect in enabling us to achieve whatever our goals are? Now, the setting for me in those 3 particular focus areas is something like the following. I don't mean this, sometimes when I use this analogy it's seen as a criticism. I don't mean it that way at all. 5 years after Pearl Harbor, the United States had defeated Japan, Germany, and Italy, implemented the industrial base as an economic position, put the Marshall Plan in place to recover the European continent, and organized a set of global alliances which saw us through the longest period of peace in the 20th century. And all my kids were raised in that. Part of my career was a part of that. We got in some fights on occasion, but they were sustainable and they weren't core combats that we had to deal with. They organized a research and development capacity which created technologies second to none. And in the world I come from, you have to have technology that is second to none. So we're not talking about a close call with regard to the technologies that are used. And then they established a national security model, which you all are familiar with, as people have come and spoken to you from that national security model, a portion of which is the intelligence community, and a portion of that is the National Security Agency, and it had an authorizing environment that legally allowed it to perform the mission which it was given. And it performed that mission within the law and still does today. I'll bring some questions up about what those complexities are in the future, but at least let that sustain itself. And then most importantly, academia was involved. And so we came to functions like this because we needed to learn about the complex challenges both from a policy and implementation perspective and from an operational perspective, so that when Scott and I are sitting there picking targets in the middle of the night in Iraq, we have to know the law of armed conflict. And when we do that within the laws of the nation, and we conducted those discussions from things we had learned in forums like this in the past. These forums don't happen that much anymore today, yet I would argue the complexities of the challenge are substantial. Never mind how the Cold War went in the setting sense, but let me just sort of say in an inelegant way, great victory. It was a victory by a set of teams in industry, in uniform, and in academia. I never went anywhere that those three pieces weren't present in those difficult challenges. You didn't have to wear a uniform to serve in those days. We don't have to wear uniforms to serve today. Led to an unprecedented period of peace, but I would argue in some ways many of us in this room who were not directly involved ceded, if you spell the word with a C, we ceded to the government many of the pieces of the national security, I'll use the term homeland security in my presentation, which we had historically held in a cherished position in industry and academia. And as a result, that three-legged stool has over time, as the century wound down, really become primarily positioned around the government, as opposed to the stability of having the government, industry, and academia involved in how we go forward in that great struggle. So ceding those responsibilities has led in part to the diminishing of the debate in public and the concern, well, would anybody in government listen to me depending upon what your political orientations are and so on and so forth. And I don't think those are really germane to the need. So in that setting, the first focus area for me at least is what's changed is I ran the National Security Agency, what was known as the peace dividend. And so we didn't have any money. I mean, we had barely enough. We reduced the size of the agency by 35%. We were hiring 126 people a year, and I was overseeing every one of those hires for a very large outfit. So it was quite an interesting and difficult time. But the point there is, it didn't turn out that was the cessation of hostilities, right? We were entering a very conflictual relationship in a global sense, even though we were at the time seeing the management structure as a peace dividend. We were going through the greatest revolution in information technology we had seen since the turn of the 20th century. And so you had the emergence of the digital revolution, all of the technologies and the network that were coming into play, all challenges to the intelligence apparatus, and none more challenged than the National Security Agency in that context. You could sort of say you're in the early stages of conflict in the information age. And the result was we had terrible conflictual relationships with our adversaries, a brand new operating technology environment, and for the most part we were in a technology ghetto at that time relative to those challenges that we faced, for all good reasons in that context. But now we're fighting what I think is aptly described as a long war. So the piece that I take from the Cold War forward is that took us a long time, and the war we're in today is going to take us a long time. The enemy is committed, has a very focused strategy on our economy, and has said publicly it's going to take decades to win. So there's no backing down from their perspective. It is a huge intelligence challenge, far greater than any we've had to face before because of the operating environment that we're in. If only 1/10 of 1% of the enemy of the larger population in the world that we might have to deal with were of concern to us, you would be talking about hundreds of thousands of potential terrorists we would be trying to find in that larger operating environment. So imagine two problems. One, you're looking for those 100,000+ people who want to do something as a part of that combat that we're talking about. And two, you have to determine the foreign intelligence value of that search in seconds, because you will want to use what you learn from them in a way which influences the outcome of what they're trying to do. Their capabilities are growing. Let's just set aside the violence of the attack, the IEDs, the suicide bombers, and so on. Look at the technology environment that they're operating in. It's growing exponentially. It's becoming much more elegant. It's much more capable of supporting their needs from a command and control perspective. So the technologies of the internet have actually been substantially enabling for them. And they have some key elements that they can fight from relative to that technology, because we did not build that internet technology out in a way which would allow us to trust it and be able to keep a technology advantage in it. On our side, the key elements for ending that war are this notion of protect, defend, cope, and recover, homeland security, to try and keep combat outside the United States. And for the intelligence community, this term detect. How do you get in front of protect and operate in that wider operating environment where you try and figure out what event is going to occur which has not occurred yet, but which I would like to disrupt? It's a substantial technical challenge. The way I like to describe it sometimes from an intelligence person's perspective is, in the days that we worked together, intelligence apparatus was a farming apparatus. You knew where the enemy was. It was in a geographical location. You could watch and listen and look at things going on in that geographical location. You could see that they were building missiles. You could measure missiles. You could kind of infer about how far they'd go. You'd have some sense of their testing, but you knew that you were farming that area, and you just kind of worked it every day, and you developed a sense of trends that were there. And those trends were what was used to detect where the adversary might go next. Now, the intelligence apparatus, the community writ large, and the National Security Agency specifically, has to become a hunter. It's not a farming environment at all. It's not about the trends. It's about, as I look over that field, why is that little place different? What is making the grass bend in that direction as opposed to all the rest of the grass doing something else? How do I go and find people who are learning to fly but not learning to land? In a world of people all learning to fly, which includes taking off and landing. And so when you start to say it's a hunting environment, you're starting to think about the characteristics of that challenge that focus has to have in terms of going forward. And if you develop that context, then you'll have some sense now of what the challenge looks like from the NSA's perspective. So the complexities here are substantial and tee up this whole notion of the convergence of law, the convergence of technology, and the convergence of the intelligence apparatus. Essentially, we're in a networked environment. We've long ago passed any sort of physical or virtual foundation of boundaries from which we can kind of separate things and isolate them and farm. So everything is integrated, and that's the way the network should be. That's the way the technologies are, and they facilitate what we've got to do. It's an important strategic advantage to us commercially. It's also a substantial strategic vulnerability to us. So how do you balance this whole notion of a global economy in which we can make a lot of money in a networked environment with the vulnerabilities that it's bringing to us as a part of the businesses that we want to do going forward, and as a part of this intelligence apparatus that we're asking to do the detection piece. So this network now becomes a critical operating environment. The way I like to think about it is the enemy is hiding in plain sight in the networked environment, and we have to go find them. They're not available to us from a farming perspective. We actually have to go out and hunt for that adversary, that 100,000+ people who may want to do us harm and who have conducted themselves in that network in order to organize, train, and equip themselves for those purposes. So with regard to the sort of the wartime piece of this whole notion, the big idea here, I think, is homeland security. If you were to take something away from here, I think the homeland, in my view, for us, is the global operating environment where we live, work, do business, and have combat. And so we are not separated in this room from that environment. We're all a part of it today. We're kind of on active duty here serving Scott, thinking about important national security things. And security is about being able to exist in that environment in spite of the fact that something is trying to do us harm. So how do you get tough enough to protect, defend, cope, and recover? To go through that conflictual relationship in that operating environment in which we've got to exist. When I got home and our son had been in the Pentagon and he was fine, and my wife asked me the question, you know, will it happen again and will it be okay? You know exactly what she wanted to hear. It won't happen again and we'll be okay. But the right answer is it will happen again and we'll be okay because we're doing the right things from a homeland security to be tough enough to compete in that environment. Well, this detect piece is really critical to get right in that new technology environment, in the conflictual relationships that exist. And that strategic sense of acting in that context is a very important piece of understanding what you see when you read about the activities of the intelligence apparatus that we have today. So detecting in the advance of an act is a very difficult concept to get under control. The best analogy I can use is Scott and I are military. We all know about safety programs. Everybody's got a safety program. But you never know the accidents you prevent. You don't. So the metric really isn't there. Every now and then you'll know you stopped something. But for the most part, you have to live with this inelegant sense of success in that nothing happened. And I'm successful in that context, knowing that you'll fail at some point. So the second thought in this notion of the focus of this notion of detect is balancing now within the context of the homework assignment that Scott gave me, balancing this notion here of the demands of liberty with the demands of security in the technology environment that we just talked about. And in order to protect American lives and liberty, you need an intelligence community which is both powerful in its capabilities and secretive in its operations. It has to exist in a political environment which on occasion distrusts those two things the most, right? Secrecy and power. So you wouldn't be shocked to know that, but that's the world that we're going to exist in this 21st century, not unlike some of the challenges that we faced in the 20th century, but in a significantly different technology environment. So if you detect in advance of defend, cope, and recover, then you're out in a world where the net is a very wide net, but the search is for a very few people, very few activities. The way I like to think, you hear needles in the haystack, we want to get all the needles in one stack. That's how difficult you want to think the challenge is, and then go through those needles. It often involves failure, so you're not going to succeed. I mentioned to you the notion of success may be unclear, and since there has not yet been an act, you have to have some confidence that within the rule of law, the activities that are occurring are consistent with the authorizing environment which we've set forward. So you can sort of start to think about, is that authorizing environment derivative from the one in 1946 that I mentioned to you, 5 years after Pearl Harbor? So modern communications don't make that authorizing environment any easier. Gone are the days I can remember when the bad people communicated in a certain way, the national security apparatus communicated in a certain way, and industry, civilians communicated a certain way. And we just sort of teed up the two adversaries, the national security apparatus and the bad actors, and we could conduct all of this activity essentially in a framework that was independent of the commercial infrastructure. Now, all these communications and activities, Al-Qaeda, they coexist in the same global network with your phone calls and my email. They're all together, and they're all mixed, and so you're trying to find those, get them someplace where all the needles are in the same place, and then deal with the issue of detect that I mentioned about you. So the context really does matter because you want all of this activity to be within the rule of law. And one of the responsibilities the intelligence community has is to alert the authorizing environment that the conditions are changing. So my view is there are some alarms going off that suggest the conditions are changing and that we ought to start looking carefully at the authorizing environment as we go forward. So let's make that my last focus. If that's the context that we need to think about some changes, I'll share with you the foreign intelligence piece and then a couple, 3 issues that I think are worth thinking about. First, in foreign intelligence, I always tell my wife, you know, so we grew up, the term that many people will use is called an intelligence failure. I know none of you have heard that term before. But it's a loving term which suggests that, tell Dickie Myers when you see him tomorrow, it's a loving term which suggests if it was a fact, it wouldn't be intelligence. I mean, right? I mean, here we are in the middle of the night, we don't quite know. And we're going to have to make some decisions off of not quite knowing. And some of them are going to be good calls and some are not. But just load in the back of your head, if it was a fact, it wouldn't be intelligence. And so that's the world that this foreign intelligence value process exists in as you start to think about it, when you're having your other discussions around here. In that context, then, you have to have collection, which is operational, technological, and legal. That's the NSA challenge. It's got to work. It's got to be technically better than the adversary, and it needs to be legal. That's the requirement. There isn't any other. It isn't any more difficult than that. But what is collected has to have inherent foreign intelligence value. There's no one motivated to collect more than the needles. It's a tough enough job in that context. And if you look at what you've got to do, there's no other challenge. So there's no reason for us to think of being outside the law or inconsistent with the rules of privacy which we have. It's got to be focused and targeted. It's got to be carefully done. And one of the pieces which I think gets lost when you have this discussion, it's got to be done by an informed workforce. Those of you who have visited NSA will not meet a smarter, more well-trained, educated, and focused, law-abiding workforce than the workforce which is doing this business for you. And so that workforce is second to none in its operational and technical prowess and its desire to follow the rule of law. The traditional sensitivity to privacy is writ large, not only in the National Security Agency's charter, but in the way it does process and policy implementation for the things which it's asked to do. But there's also some, it's not that difficult. There's some thresholds that you can think about when you want to do foreign intelligence. We're at war, right? That's number one. We're at war, and we've got some issues we have to deal with in the context of that war, Homeland Security. And then if you think about the foreign intelligence piece, it needs to be focused, but it has to be relevant. It's got to be valuable. It's got to fit somewhere. If I've detected it, I've got to take it someplace so that it can be used. It has to report that in a context that it can be usable, and so it's got to be timely and what have you. And then within its own operating environment, it has to recognize change and inform oversight. So you're at the environment now is one, in my view, which is change is being recognized and oversight is being informed, and there now needs to be an adjustment within the rule of law of the authorizing environment in which we conduct those activities. So I don't think it's as easy to solve as a sentence or a stroke of a pen or a policy that's set. I think it's a very complex, and it will take us several years to get it exactly the way we want it. That is not unlike what it took from the mid-40s to the mid-50s for us to build the apparatus that served us all well in the 70s and 80s. So I don't have any trouble, so to speak, with this taking a little bit of time. Now, buried in here is this notion of domestic spying, which I'm surveilling the enemy is what I'm doing. And buried in there is kind of an interesting notion here of hunting, right? If I'm going to go hunting for that adversary, and you've read about all of the articles that have been written, essentially I'm not hunting in the United States. I'm hunting in an environment where there are zillions, literally, of communicative activities between the United States and outside the United States, and I want to find those needles, all the needles, in those zillions that go with one point in the United States and one point outside. So it's not about domestic activity at all. It's about hunting for those communications from someone in the United States and something entering or leaving the United States. And the detection point is there to prevent something bad from happening. So that's the characteristic of that third piece of the challenge. I mentioned to you that I'd share with you a couple of three issues which I think are worth thinking about in a forum like this. One, what constitutes a U.S. person? Now, I'm just betting there's some lawyers in this room, so I don't want to start that debate now. But I just want you to know that the law protects, I didn't say citizen, the law protects people who come within our jurisdiction, within our boundaries. Our adversaries don't see that boundary at all in the way they conduct business. And the story of those of you who've heard me speak before, if Osama bin Laden were coming from Canada to New York across Niagara Falls and were conducting command and control of a terrorist attack in the United States that was about to happen, the moment he reached the United States, he got the privacy and protection of a U.S. person. You know, and so this notion here of what is a U.S. person is important. What's the technology footprint of you and me as we go forward? It used to be pretty easy. I'm Ken Minihan. I got a social security number. Maybe I got a phone or something. Somebody's already stole my identity, so everybody's got my social security number. That's another story. But I've got my PDA with me. Somebody's got a cell phone somewhere else. I've got a computer at home. I mean, my technology footprint is substantially greater and more complex than it used to be. Secondly, my geographical footprint is different. I work in Washington, D.C. I live in Annapolis. I'm here. I'm going to go to the Middle East, and all of that stuff is going with me. We like that. But the technology now says I am not in that bordered area in which you think of me as a U.S. person. But I'm out there with all my technology I'm just doing the business that I want to do. And lastly, what's the legal footprint? You know, how do you go, we're not going to rewrite the Constitution. So how do you understand, this is not the first time we've been through technology change. How do we understand that technology change and start to bring into play the important changes, the important authorizing environment that's necessary? Second, probable cause and reasonable basis. Again, I know there's lawyers here. The point would be, I would not suggest, nor do I know anyone who's suggesting that we dismiss the power of probable cause and reasonable in that context. So I'm not making an argument that you can lower the standard to suspicion or something less than the high order which we've always held. But we do need to think about, if probable cause has not changed, then what has changed is the notion of combat and where it is relative to us. It's right here in this room as a part of that environment that we're in. And what has changed is the technology that's available, as I mentioned to you, as I travel and so on. So what really am I in that world? And those are the issues that we need to get at. And within that technology that's changed, I just want to earmark for you, in the old days, the distance between detection and reaction was reasonable. It was not like that. Now it is. So the distance between detection and reaction has collapsed almost completely. And so you don't have the time frame that most of the authorizing environment envisioned when you had a change in that sequence of events you needed to deal with them. You now don't have the time that's necessary for you to go and make the adjustments that are there. So what does that lead me to my last sort of, what do you want to think about? So let's talk about FISA for just a minute. For those of you who know the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it's the authorizing environment for the National Security Agency in the area that Scott brings up. First, it needs to recognize change. The circumstances matter in the context that you have that authorizing environment. I've mentioned to you that it's the responsibility of the intelligence community to alert that there have been changes in that environment. I've shared with you what I think some of those are, the technology, time frame, and so on and so forth. So you might say FISA is, as an approach, is kind of obsolete. It's the framework for monitoring a known terrorist as opposed to trying to hunt for a terrorist. And I'm not trying to be cute with my words, but the assumption of probable cause sits in there, which we probably will not have as we go forward. And so if I don't know you're a terrorist and I'm hunting for you, that's the authorizing environment that needs to permit that activity within the rule of law. And lastly, the oversight piece is very important. Typically now, oversight is in 2 or 3 areas. So in the government construct, it's on the legislative side, and academia, comes and goes in it, but that piece is always there too. And so if you think of it in an oversight sense of the authorizing environment, becoming complex in your understanding of that world that we're going to be doing this business is huge, in my view, because I think my grandkids' future and my children's future is dependent on it. So I don't think it's any less a challenge than in 1946 when America's greatest generation put together a national security apparatus which took us through several decades of peaceful growth and economic competition. It's as important as that we get this right. You don't want to come back here and have a discussion that says the greatest years of the American intelligence apparatus are behind it. We want that to remain in front of us. So having this authorizing environment, having the workforce that's capable of doing it, and then the technologies that allow us to succeed, I think are critical. So let me just wind up. If in this massive sense of infrastructure that we exist in, it will be the engine room of economic success of unimagined proportions, but it carries with it this huge vulnerability which we need to think about because it's being used against us and it's costing us people's lives. Your future and my future depend on us keeping that intelligence community that we talked about in front of us. The enemy is clear in their intentions, the enemy is clear in their time frame, and the enemy is clear that they want to attack the United States again. So there should be no doubt, in my view, this term detect is a very important capability that we'd like to have. We've had some successes. General Hayden in his news conference said, I'm sure they have, I don't know anyone, I don't go there, so I'm not aware of any, but I know there have been some because people say it. And I know I'm also comfortable with accidents which were avoided by my safety program. So I don't need that strong a metric as a part of it. We have some work to do, and the work is in taking care of America's finest in its intelligence apparatus, which is really for you and I on freedom's frontier, out there in that wide space, that domain that's technically very sophisticated, hunting for those people who are trying to do us harm before that harm can occur. Those really are our greatest resource. It's been grown nicely, it's very capable, and you'd be very proud of the job that they're doing. But they do that job today, and they will do that job in the future in a way that's consistent with the laws and our authorizing environment. We want to make sure that we've given them all the tools that they need in that authorizing environment. I mean this as a respectful ending comment, not as disrespectful. It really isn't the Constitution that protects you and me. It's those people. And it's those people who are out there, military in uniform, civilians. It's you in this room who are spending some of your time today thinking about the difficult challenges that the country faces that are really deriving the power from the Constitution to do those jobs, who get up every day and take care of us as they do those things that are important. So to get back to seeded with a C, it's time to reseed, spell the term with an S. Homeland security is too important to be left to the government alone. It needs to be a part of our daily lives too. In my case, I've focused on an area which is important, I think, to me, and which I hope is important to you to think about as we go forward. Having shared that view of is it domestic spying or is it surveilling the enemy in wartime, my view is clear. Everyone else in the country, interestingly enough, will have a view. Interestingly enough, it will have the same impact that I mentioned to you with regard to our future. It's critical to our safety and success, and it's their view. And so the final score is not in on how this is going to go. I look forward to your questions. Thanks for inviting me here today.
Thank you very much, General Minihan. We do have about 10 minutes of time, and literally he's going to have to catch a flight back this afternoon in about an hour. But he has agreed to entertain a few questions. I would ask, since we don't have the wireless mics, if you'll stand, speak as clearly and loudly as you can, and identify yourself. Any questions?
General Art Harris,
Hey, Art.
journalist and TV producer and now consultant. The importance of human intelligence in this age of technological racing for the next step. How important is it to drill down?
I think he asked about human intelligence. I will avoid trying to say one's more important than the other because I don't think that's the case. I think they're all important. The one that's critically underserved right now is human. And it's less about numbers and money. It's more about understanding the world in which we're having to make these decisions and communication. So I don't think it's, quote, spying, like people will periodically use the term. I think it's much more about human intelligence. So I think you asked the question properly. And we have to build up and understand this complex world that we're in so that, as you guys were talking in your morning sessions, if you expect to be a world power and expect to be in all the different places we might have to be a lot more present in our understanding of the cultural and operational environment we're in than we are today. So that in my view, so hugely important, very complex. It's not something that you don't go hire 20 people and you're done tomorrow. You're talking about generations to get that piece right. If we don't get that piece right, we're going to make a lot of mistakes before we can kind of get to those solutions that we need to get to.
Yes, sir.
Hey,
Could you put a little more flesh on the bones of the changes in the authorizing environment that you see today?
I will, but just think of them as my view. I went to FISA as an example, could be outdated. I don't think FISA is, quote, broken. But in the envisionment right now, you essentially have a time frame which is too long. You have a process which is constructed around, which is not responsive to hunting, it's responsive to farming, probable cause and that sort of thing. And it's arranged in such a way that it has this notion of a U.S. person in its definition, which doesn't fit the technology environment. So where I would head is how can you modify that to recognize this need to be quicker, this need to be more precise in hunting without what I'll call, this is it's a known terrorist, it's somebody I'm looking for, and then if having gotten those two pieces done, can I arrange it in such a way that you can conduct it in a quick time?
Yes, sir.
In this environment, what you are asking for and what you need is the trust of the American people. And in this environment, would what NSA does be better done outside Mr. Rumsfeld?
Well, first, there's no question you need the trust of the American people, and I'm not sure that's lost. But I would stand with you and tell you, I know the people, and that you'd be proud to have them as your neighbors, and you could trust them. So I don't have any trouble standing up for that piece. I'm actually going to answer it a little more directly than that. I'm going to give you a little vignette. I believe the American people see the Department of Defense as the custodian for the intelligence apparatus that does what I described. There's an expectation that it will take care of that. You would not be happy with the Department of Defense's performance in taking care of that capability in the last 10 years, independent of who's been in charge. So we are underserving the American people's sense, I think, in DOD of how to take care of those national human things which fit out in that detection area but don't necessarily result in immediate operational capability. I would not give us high marks for taking care of that in the last several years. And I think the people have an expectation. So would I move it or not? I can go through that if you want, but I think at the end of the day we haven't done that well in the transition.
We're going to take one more question. Yes, sir.
Terry Henderson, Raleigh. What did you know and when did you know it?
What did I know and when did I know it? You're selling my wife. I'm not talking.
No, it's really about following the money. Does NSA involve itself in looking at financial transactions moving around the world as it relates to the enemy that we are trying to do reconnaissance on?
I don't want to go to, I don't think I want to go where you want to take me a little bit in terms of what operationally is NSA doing. I just would tell you they're not asleep at the switch.
And I think on that answer, which reinforces everything he said about how much we should respect the personnel that are doing that very tough mission. Gentlemen, I'm going to thank you once again, sir. Thank you for taking time. Take that one back.